The sun had barely broken the horizon when the rumble of distant rotors stirred the morning air. A low mist clung to the edges of the base, rolling like a ghost across the gravel landing zone. Soldiers moved with urgency, their boots thudding against the dirt, their eyes fixed on the skies where the Black Hawk was due to arrive. Among the organized chaos, she walked alone. Her steps were deliberate, her uniform crisp, her gaze fixed on the massive bird crouched at the far end of the airfield. Every inch of her projected discipline, but there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't come from just another drill. This was more than a mission. This was the moment she had trained for, bled for, stayed up countless nights preparing for, and it was here. But the air shifted as she approached. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A ripple of confusion ran through the group of soldiers clustered around the Black Hawk. They looked at her, then at each other, eyes narrowing, lips curling. One by one, they began to murmur. "She's not part of this op, is she? Never seen her in any briefings. Check her patch, what even is that?" The voices were low but sharp, like barbed wire beneath the skin. Some didn't even pretend to whisper. "What's she think she's doing here? Parades down the block." She kept walking. The patch on her arm, a symbol too few recognized, seemed to draw more attention than her presence itself. It wasn't one of the regular unit insignias. It wasn't one they taught about in ROTC or bragged about in bars. This one was quiet. Older. Heavier. She reached the edge of the landing zone where a group of male officers, some her age, most older, stood loosely formed like a wall. One of them, clearly the loudest in the bunch, stepped forward. He had that look, shoulders too wide for his frame, chin always tilted slightly upward like he was perpetually about to tell someone no, and that's exactly what he did. "Ma'am," he said, drawing the word out with mock respect, "I think you're lost. This one's not for support staff." She said nothing at first. Just looked at him. Calm. Silent. The kind of silence that makes arrogant men nervous. He squinted, scanning her badge, her uniform, her face. "You serious right now?" he asked, laughter lacing his voice. "You think you're flying out with us?" Behind him, someone let out a snort. Another muttered, "Maybe she brought snacks." The disrespect wasn't new. She had heard it before, too many times to count. In the academy, in the field, even from civilians. But it never hit quite like it did when it came from those who wore the same flag on their shoulder. Still, she didn't flinch. Not when the man in front of her shook his head and turned away. Not when another officer mumbled, probably just a translator or PR. Not when she felt the eyes of nearly 24 soldiers pressing on her like a silent vote of dismissal. She glanced at the chopper, its blades now idling, heat shimmer rising from its engines. It was ready. She was ready. But readiness in this world was rarely enough. Not when you were a woman standing where they didn't expect to see you. Not when you carried a patch that told a story most of them didn't care to read. One final voice rang out louder, more commanding. "We don't have room for tourists." That one stung, not because of the words, but because of who said it. A major she had once trained under. He should have known better. He did know better. And yet here he was, letting the room set the tone instead of correcting it. She stood still. No protest. No argument. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was discipline. She'd seen enough battles to know which ones needed words and which ones needed something else entirely. Behind her, the wind shifted. The rhythm of the bass changed slightly. But she didn't turn around. Not yet. She knew what was coming. She had waited for this moment, not for their approval, but for the truth to speak for itself. Laughter wasn't new to her. She'd heard it in classrooms when she answered too confidently. She'd heard it on the training grounds when she ran faster than expected, when she shot straighter, when she stood taller than they assumed she would. But this kind of laughter, raw, mocking, thick with disbelief, cut through the engine noise and the orders like a serrated knife. The moment she stepped into the staging area, the tone of the group changed. They were standing near the transport crates, gear slung loosely over their shoulders, joking in that typical pre-mission swagger that masked nerves. But when they saw her approach, boots dusty, face steady, patch gleaming faintly in the morning light, their jokes shifted. It started with a scoff. One of them tilted his head back and let out a theatrical sigh. "Oh great! Did someone order a morale officer?" The others laughed. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't teasing. It was the kind of laughter that made her skin tighten, that made her heartbeat steady itself like a boxer bracing for the bell. She didn't slow her steps. She must be here to write the press release, another said, elbowing the guy beside him. Hope she got our good sides. They chuckled like it was all a game. Like she hadn't spent more hours in flight simulations than most of them had in live drills. Like she hadn't been through SEER training with temperatures that cracked bones and wind that stole sleep. None of that mattered now. Because to them she was just a face they didn't recognize and a body they didn't expect. Yo, check out that patch. What is that, some kind of Girl Scout badge? That one stung more than the others. Not because it was clever, it wasn't, but because it showed how little they knew. That patch meant something. It was a ghost mark, a remnant from a covert unit so off the books most of their files were sealed before she'd even enlisted. It was the kind of insignia you didn't talk about. You didn't brag about. You earned it and carried it in silence. Not for glory, but because you'd seen things you couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there too. But they didn't know that. They didn't want to know that. A younger guy, barely out of his 20s, nudged another and said, "Bet she's the pilot's girlfriend. Probably here for a photo op." That one drew a bigger laugh, louder, more confident now that the group was forming a pack. There's safety in numbers, especially when the target's standing alone. It made them brave. It always did. She stood there, arms crossed, not smiling. Her silence wasn't confusion, it was calculation. She knew what they were doing. They were testing her. Trying to push her back into the space they thought she belonged, the background. "What's wrong, can't take a joke?" one of them asked when she didn't flinch. "You got that, I'm better than you vibe. Is that standard with that patch?" Someone behind him pretended to salute her, overdramatic and dripping with sarcasm. "Ma'am, permission to carry your gear?" More laughter. They didn't realize how loud they gotten. Or maybe they didn't care. Maybe they thought they were safe in the assumption that their words didn't matter. That she wouldn't push back. That she was used to this. In a way, she was. But being used to something doesn't mean it hurts less. It just means you've learned to armor against it. She remembered the first time a commanding officer laughed when she said she wanted flight clearance. He'd told her it was cute. Told her to go be useful somewhere else. She remembered the smirks during her performance evals. The lowered voices. The way they never expected her to last through the second round of selections, let alone make it to final briefings. Yet she was here, and they were laughing again. A few feet away, one of the more senior NCOs, gray in his beard and bitter in his tone, shook his head slowly and muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "Some people just don't know when they're out of their league." She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. Not angry, not wounded, just steady. Like a soldier who'd been through worse and knew that storms didn't need to be outrun. They needed to be endured. The mocking didn't stop, but it shifted. Beneath the jokes was something else now, uncertainty, confusion, maybe even a bit of fear, because she hadn't cracked. She hadn't stormed off or snapped back. She'd stood her ground like someone who had every right to be there, like someone who knew something they didn't. The shift in atmosphere was subtle at first. A momentary lull in conversation. A shared glance. The type of silence that precedes something important, like a still forest just before thunder. She didn't turn to look yet. Her eyes were still fixed on the ones in front of her, the men who had just laughed at her presence, mocked her patch, dismissed her like she was a misplaced intern wandering into a classified briefing. The senior NCO who had made the last remark about being out of her league seemed to be preparing for one final jab. His mouth opened, lips parting to unleash something else bitter, something crude. But before he could speak, he stopped. His gaze shifted just slightly over her shoulder. His posture changed not much, but enough. His spine straightened like instinct, not intention. Others started noticing too. The energy changed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Chuckles dissolved into throat clearing. A few of them lowered their heads slightly, adjusting their posture without even thinking. The man who had joked about her being a PR rep suddenly closed his mouth and stepped aside. One of the youngest in the group blinked twice and stood up straighter, eyes darting to his boots, then back to the figure now approaching from the far side of the tarmac. She knew who it was before they did. She didn't need to turn to feel the shift in the air, the weight of command rolling across the gravel like the first tremor before a quake. The sound of polished boots on hardened ground echoed with calm precision. No one else walked like that, not around here. Not with that kind of measured confidence. The sound wasn't loud, but it demanded attention in a way yelling never could. He was known simply as the Colonel. No one used his full name anymore, not out of disrespect, but because he had long since surpassed the need for formal introductions. His record was quiet, sealed behind enough red tape to fill a vault. But every man and woman on that base knew who he was. You didn't question where he'd been, you just listened when he spoke. And when he walked toward you, you cleared the way. She remained still. Her face gave nothing away, but her hands, gloved, steady, flexed just slightly, the tendons tightening like a memory resurfacing. She had seen that man before, not in passing, not in a hallway or ceremony, but in the kind of places that didn't show up on maps, where the only witnesses were dirt and blood and coded radio signals. He hadn't seen her since. The Colonel didn't speak right away. He stopped just short of the circle of men that had formed around her, saying more with his stillness than any command could have. The silence stretched, not awkward, not empty, but charged. It was a silence that asked a question louder than any accusation. What's going on here? One of the officers, realizing too late who had arrived, opened his mouth to offer something, maybe a greeting, maybe an excuse. But the Colonel raised one hand barely above waist height, and the sound died before it started. His eyes moved slowly across the faces in front of him. Each one of them looked away in turn, their smirks wiped clean, their confidence shriveled into something smaller. Then his eyes landed on her. It wasn't a dramatic moment. He didn't gasp. He didn't salute. He didn't say her name. But his face changed. Not all at once, not like some Hollywood script, just enough to register the flicker of recognition. The way his brow twitched. The way the corner of his mouth tightened. The way his eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, not in shame, but in memory. His gaze moved to the patch on her shoulder. That was the moment everything truly changed. Because the Colonel knew that patch. He didn't just recognize it, he remembered it. And not from a report or a briefing. From the kind of operations that never made it to paper. From the kind of missions where you didn't ask for names because you might not live long enough to say goodbye. That patch didn't belong to some PR team. It wasn't sewn for ceremony or tradition. It was earned where comms failed and backup never came. He took one step closer. His voice, when it came, was low. Calm. But there was steel in it. Command. Authority. And something else, something only she could hear. Something that made the entire unit just seconds ago puffed with arrogance shrink under the weight of a single presence. She finally turned. Not fully. Just enough to meet his eyes. And in that locked moment, between soldier and commander, between ghosts of missions past and truths too heavy to speak, everything the others thought they knew began to collapse. His gaze lingered on the patch, and with it, the air thickened. It wasn't just recognition, it was reverence. The Colonel's face, hardened by years in shadows and war zones most couldn't pronounce, softened just enough for those watching to notice. Something about that insignia had stopped him in his tracks. Something they couldn't see. Something they didn't understand. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand identification or call for confirmation from some clipboard officer. He didn't need to. The patch told him everything. A small, black thread on gray emblem. No color. No rank. Just a mark. But one that, in certain circles, weighed more than metals. Around them, the group stood frozen, their earlier mockery now feeling distant and foolish. You could feel it in the way their shoulders hunched ever so slightly, in the way their eyes darted from the Colonel to her patch and back again, trying to piece together what they'd missed. He stepped closer, not to confront her, but to stand beside her. His boots settled quietly in the gravel. That proximity alone said more than words. His body language spoke volumes. He wasn't there to dismiss her. He was standing in support, in acknowledgement. She hadn't moved. Not a single inch. Her face remained stoic, unreadable to most, but something in her eyes flickered, like a storm pushed down beneath calm waters. She'd waited for this moment, not to prove them wrong, but because eventually, the truth always steps out of the shadows. The Colonel slowly extended a hand, not to shake hers, not to welcome her, but to gently tap the patch on her shoulder with two fingers, light but deliberate. A gesture that could have been missed by someone not paying attention. But for the men around them, it was deafening. Because in their world, the Colonel didn't touch patches. He didn't offer symbols. He didn't explain himself. But here he was acknowledging something sacred, something earned, something that spoke of a different league entirely. There was a silence and then a murmur, not from the colonel, but from one of the younger soldiers who leaned in and whispered, "What is that patch?" The question hung in the air like fog. One of the older officers, who had been smirking just minutes ago, now stared at the insignia as if trying to recall something buried, something rumored. His face paled just slightly, his lips moving without sound. He wasn't laughing anymore. None of them were. She still didn't speak. She didn't have to. The colonel turned to face the group, his eyes sweeping over them with the quiet force of a commander who didn't yell unless it mattered. "That's not just any patch," he said at last, his voice firm and low, almost reverent. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to, because those few words hit like a thunderclap. They all stood differently now. The casual stances were gone. Arms lowered. Eyes focused. The same men who had cracked jokes about morale officers and media teams now stood motionless, some even adjusting their uniforms, as if trying to erase the last 10 minutes from history. The colonel turned back to her. The unspoken message passed again between them, one built on operations where speaking had been a liability, where silence meant survival. He gave her a slight nod, barely there, but deeply meaningful. A sign not of hierarchy, but of respect between equals who had both earned something beyond rank. She returned the nod, just as slight, just as controlled. It wasn't about pride. It was about understanding. The colonel looked to the flight crew by the Black Hawk. "Is this bird ready?" he asked. They straightened immediately. "Yes, sir. Engines warm. Cleared for lift." The colonel motioned toward her, not with grandiosity but with quiet certainty. "She flies with me." No one questioned it. Not now. Not after that patch. Not after his voice had wrapped around those 4 words like steel. The same men who had blocked her path, who had dismissed her presence, now watched her walk past them toward the bird. None dared to speak. Their silence wasn't ordered. It was earned. One soldier, "I still on the patch," whispered, almost like a prayer, "Where the hell did she come from?" But no one answered, because now they were too busy rethinking everything they thought they knew. The patch had become the center of gravity. Everything that had been said before, the laughter, the mockery, the arrogance, had crumbled under the weight of that small, unassuming piece of cloth. It wasn't flashy. It didn't shimmer in the sunlight or scream for attention. But its silence held stories that demanded respect. And now even those who had spoken the loudest were shrinking in its presence. They stared at it as if it might speak. As if it might explain itself. As if it might justify why someone like her, a woman they had dismissed in less than a glance, stood at the center of a space they thought was reserved for them. But that patch didn't speak. It didn't need to. The truth behind it wasn't something you found in field manuals or printed on base walls. It wasn't mentioned in passing during mission briefings. It was buried in reports that were redacted to black ink and rumors that traveled in whispers. It belonged to a unit so deep, so buried, that even asking about it could raise questions. It was the mark of ghosts. Soldiers sent into operations that didn't exist, across borders that weren't acknowledged, chasing targets no one would admit were real. She had earned it not through ceremony, but through silence, through missions with no backup, through choices that could never be explained, through hours alone behind enemy lines, eyes scanning shadows, heartbeat matching the rhythm of a ticking clock. She had earned it through loss, through grit, through nights where the only thing keeping her grounded was the promise she made to keep going, even when no one was watching. And now, finally, someone was watching, but not in the way they expected. The men around her, the ones who had just moments ago laughed and jeered, now looked like strangers in their own skins. The colonel's acknowledgement had rewritten the rules of the moment. They'd been playing checkers while she was operating in a world of chess. And suddenly, they realized they didn't even know the board. One of the sergeants stepped back slightly, as if distance could undo the words he'd thrown her way earlier. Another rubbed the back of his neck, casting a sideways glance at his comrades. No one dared to meet her eyes. A younger soldier leaned toward another and whispered, "I thought that unit was shut down." The response came in a quiet murmur. Maybe not all of it. The weight of her silence now made sense. The calm she carried wasn't just discipline, it was knowledge. It was knowing that the things she had done, the places she had been, could never be put into words that these men would understand. Her experiences didn't fit into the neat boxes of their world. She didn't need their validation. She carried something more. The colonel remained nearby, his posture unchanged. He didn't need to explain himself, and he didn't try to. His presence alone was the statement. And the patch, the very symbol they had laughed at, had become a reminder that they had underestimated something far beyond what they could comprehend. She didn't move to speak. Her silence, once misread as uncertainty, now spoke of discipline honed through trials they could only imagine. It was the silence of someone who had crawled through darkness and emerged not looking for applause, but simply ready for what came next. Every soldier knew what that kind of silence meant now. The truth behind the patch wasn't just a symbol. It was a legacy. A legacy written not in ink but in operations lost to time, in teammates left behind, in nights spent in listening posts counting breaths and bullets. It was a legacy that didn't require a spotlight. It simply was. And they saw it now not with awe at first, but with shame. The jokes, the arrogance, the dismissal, it all sat heavy in their throats. They had measured her by surface and swagger, never stopping to wonder what kind of fire forged her. Someone near the rear of the group shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "We didn't know," but ignorance wasn't a defense anymore. Not when truth stood right in front of them. Now they knew. They knew that patch wasn't given. It wasn't earned through time and grade or checking boxes. It was forged in the crucible of operations where one mistake meant no return. It was held by a rare few soldiers who were never supposed to be seen. Never supposed to stand in the open. Yet here she was. The truth behind the patch wasn't just about what it meant. It was about who wore it. And why no one, not even seasoned officers, dared to challenge it once it was recognized. The blades of the Black Hawk spun steadily now, slicing the air with a deep mechanical rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the moment. Dust swirled at their feet, kicked up in hazy clouds that caught the morning sun. But no one was moving. Not yet. Not the men who had doubted her, and certainly not the woman they had tried to dismiss just minutes ago. She stepped forward slowly, not with arrogance, but with purpose. Every stride was silent defiance, a reminder that respect isn't something handed to you, it's taken, earned, forged under pressure. Her boots hit the tarmac with the weight of a truth they hadn't wanted to see until it stared them down with no apology. The same soldiers who had mocked her now stepped aside, their bodies shifting as if commanded by an invisible force. They weren't ordered to make way. No one barked a command. But their instincts kicked in, learned behavior sharpened by hierarchy and years of following unspoken rules. Something in them knew they had crossed a line, and now they were silently trying to step back over it without drawing more attention. Their eyes followed her, not with ridicule, but with something unfamiliar. Shame. Respect. Maybe even curiosity. The woman they had laughed at was now the one walking to the aircraft with the colonel at her side. One of the more vocal officers, the one who had blocked her path before, cleared his throat and shifted his stance. His eyes didn't meet hers. His confidence had evaporated somewhere between her silence and the colonel's nod. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, but closed it again. Some moments weren't meant for words. She passed them one by one. No smirk. No smug glance. Just the quiet discipline of someone who had nothing to prove anymore. They had already said everything about her, what they thought she was, what they assumed she wasn't. And then she let the patch, the colonel, and her silence answer it all. As she reached the helicopter, the crew chief, who had watched the entire scene from beside the open bay door, snapped to attention. He didn't say anything either. Just gave her a slight nod and stepped aside. There was no checklist. No second-guessing. Her place was clear now, and it didn't need to be explained. She turned to climb aboard, but in the moment before she entered, her eyes swept across the staging area one last time. The dust had settled. The laughter had died. The men were still there, but they were different now. There's something sobering about being wrong in public, about realizing you've just tried to humiliate someone who stood taller than you could ever imagine. They had tried to define her by her appearance, her gender, her silence. They hadn't asked about her record. They hadn't cared about her story. But now, they didn't just see a woman with a patch, they saw someone who had been somewhere they'd never been. Done something they'd never be allowed to do. She didn't look at them with anger. There was no revenge in her eyes. Only resolve. Only that steady, clear expression of someone who had walked through fire and come out made of iron. She took her seat without hesitation. Not in the back, not as an afterthought, but right where she belonged. Across from the colonel. Equal in presence, equal in weight. The crew began final checks. Voices crackled in headsets. The air filled with the growing roar of spinning blades, but it couldn't drown out what had just happened. That sound, that rising wind, was now tied to a moment that would sit in the minds of every person on that field long after the chopper disappeared into the sky. No one saluted. No one clapped. But everyone watched. And as the Black Hawk began to rise, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew what was behind her. A field full of men who had misjudged her. A team who had laughed, then gone silent. A space she had once stood outside of, and now owned without saying a single word. She hadn't forced them to change their minds. She had simply shown them what truth looks like when it walks through fire, wears silence like armor, and carries history on its shoulder for all to see.